I'm going to ask you one more time. Why is it that you still believe that the Ice Age was a real period in human history? What was it that convinced you? And I mean you, not other people. I'm not talking about your friends, your family, the homeless down the street that you buy crack from. No, not those people. I am talking about you. Why do you believe that the Ice Age is a legitimate period in time? What evidence did you see that convinced you that this concept was real? In fact, we can go even further. What scientific experiments have you personally performed that convinced you that the Ice Age has to have been a real period in time? What was it? Now, if you ask yourself this honestly, and I mean ask yourself this honestly, this is an extremely important point. Don't go looking anything up yet. Don't go do any of that crap. Just right now, answer the question. Pretend I'm in the room with you right now, and I have a gun pointed at your head, and I have asked you the question. Tell me what convinced you that the Ice Age is real. Right? You're not going to have time to look anything up because I have a gun pointed at your head. What's the answer that you are going to give me? Right? What answer could you provide that would convince not only yourself, but me as well, that something like the Ice Age is a real event in history? I guarantee it, the vast majority of people will stumble over this question. And the reason why is extremely simple. The only reason why the vast majority of people believe the Ice Age is a real event is simply because they have been told that it is. That's it. There's no other reason. Like I said, if you ask yourself that question, why do you believe in the Ice Age? You probably stumbled over yourself. You were probably like, well, I read it somewhere. People on social media keep telling me that scientists and experts say that it's real. So that, I guess it must be real. But that's not really evidence for you. Just because somebody else says something, that doesn't make it real, right? It's just not happening. If I say, I don't know, gummy bears built the pyramids, that's somebody saying something. Does that mean it's true? Does that mean gummy bears over there were juicing up and throwing giant blocks around and building pyramidal structures? No, of course not. So when somebody tells you something, and if you are going to believe it, you should probably have a better reason other than somebody told me, or even worse, experts claim, right? Woo! Yeah, we have a problem. We have a huge problem. And that's literally the problem with history and science. Right now, we generally rely on these quote-unquote experts in their fields, these mystical people, to tell us what to think about everything. However, very few people go out of their way to question the experts and search for corroboration that whatever they're claiming is real. And you know this to be true. Look at your life. I'm not getting down on you. I'm not talking bad about anybody. I'm being honest. Because I do this to myself because it's eye-opening. Anytime I find myself really believing in a concept, I have to stop and ask myself why. Like, what was it that convinced me, or you, whatever, that the concept is real? What did we do? What evidence? What could I tell somebody else that would convince them as well? What evidence could I show them? Right? What experimentation can you do? If you aren't asking yourself these questions and you aren't digging around, especially when it comes to a concept that you just take for granted now, the Ice Age is absolutely one of these concepts, right? If you're not questioning these specific ideas, is that really how science is done? Is that how we should be doing history? Of course not. Of course not. But the reality is nowadays, we don't question a lot of the stuff. We really do give the benefit of the doubt to mainstream historians and mainstream scientists nowadays. And we do that for one simple reason. And it's the reason why we believe a lot of the crap we believe. And that is because we have been psychologically conditioned to do it. And that's it. The vast majority of people who believe the Ice Age is a real event would never actually be able to prove to me, if I'm an outsider, let's just say I ask the question, most people are not going to be able to present me with any kind of real good scientific information off the top of their head that would really prove there's a reason to believe in the Ice Age. The reason why I say all of this, and I know I drone on about psychological conditioning, but I cannot stress how important it is to understand that a lot of the stuff that we believe in, not only just historically and scientific, but socially as well, especially socially, a lot of this stuff is simply social and psychological engineering. Now, I know that sounds insane, but go back to the question I originally asked and look at your answer. And like I said, your answer needs to be based on you not Googling or looking anything up. Just right on the spot, what would your answer be to that question? I promise, the vast majority of people who are asked this question are not going to be able to provide a scientifically accurate answer, or at least a scientifically convincing answer, at least to somebody who really is looking for the truth. Yeah, I know, I'm rambling, but I feel it's important to set the stage, because if I don't set that stage, a lot of the information we are going to talk about is not going to make as much sense as it really should. And the reason why is because we have to break through a huge chunk of our psychological conditioning to look at the evidence that I'm going to supply you guys over the course of like a million shows here that prove that something absolutely never existed that you have thought has existed your entire life. It doesn't matter how old you are. If you're listening to this, you're probably older than like 10 years old, all right? Something like that. So that means that you have probably at least almost 2 decades of psychological conditioning embedded in you. And of course, the older you are, the more of it you have. Of course, also, the older you are, the harder it is to break down. This is why I put this stuff in the shows, because it's important to break out of this crap. Okay, let's move on. Okay, well, how do you break out of it? All right, so this is the kind of stuff that can help you break through your psychological conditioning. Because one of the things that has happened, I guarantee it, is that a lot of historical researchers and scientific researchers, a lot of those researchers have probably hit some incredible snags or essentially walls that have stopped them from moving forward in their research. And I'm willing to bet a lot that a lot of the things that are stopping researchers, generally speaking, from moving forward are the psychological barriers that have been programmed into them over the course of their lives. The Ice Age is one of these barriers. The Ice Age itself is now taught as if it's a fact, right? Everywhere you look nowadays, you don't get a perspective of a theory when it comes to the Ice Age. No, you are told that, 10, 11,000 years ago, there was an Ice Age, right? Huge chunk of the planet was covered magically in ice, even though the latitudes don't line up and there's about 1 million problems with that concept. But that is what everybody is told. And of course, over the past century and a half, almost 2 centuries now, this theory of magical ice covering a part of the globe has now embedded itself into the mainstream zeitgeist. It's now embedded in our chronology, right? Because we have a date, we have 10 to 11,000 years ago, that there was, giant ice wall that our human ancestors apparently had to deal with. Even though nobody talks about it, even though not a single story from the ancients carries anything down to us that says anything like, oh yeah, today Zug and Zog and I, we were gonna walk over to America, but no, there's like a 3,000 foot ice wall, so the ice wall god stopped us. That doesn't happen. There's no such thing as an ice wall god. A 2-3 mile high wall of ice, that's pretty impressive, right? Like if you were to walk outside right now and you open your door and then pack, you smack your nose right into a 1,000 foot wall of ice at your doorstep, that's going to be pretty crazy. Like that is going to be something that is fairly awesome to see, right? And these guys are saying that it's 2-3 miles high. That's incredible. I mean, that's literally insane, right? But none of our ancestors record anything about this. There's no problems. Nobody is cursing the ice wall god, right? Nobody cares. Nobody harnesses the ice wall for anything. Nobody, there's just nothing there. So, okay, so right there, right at the beginning, it's already weird that our ancestors aren't talking about it, right? You would think there would be something. You would think there would be an echo of this, but we find nothing, all right? So, okay, I know I'm like, I don't even know where the hell I'm going with this. Okay, so we got to focus up. So we have a problem, right? So that was the point of all of that, is that we do indeed have a problem when it comes to human history. And well, we have tons of problems. It's crazy. We have billions of problems. But this is one of them. Because if the Ice Age is a real event, that would necessarily affect, human development, right? And of course it does, technically speaking, in the mainstream chronology. But it doesn't really do much because mainstream chronologists or mainstream historians or geologists or anthropologists or whatever, anybody who believes in the Ice Age, all the humans back then were just monkeys. They were just, banging on sticks, scratching their butts, sniffing themselves. That's all they were doing, apparently. Oh, and apparently they were doing that for like 5,000-6,000 years, by the way. They did nothing but just stand in the dirt and eat it. Like that. Apparently that's it. Okay, stupid, but that is what mainstream says. Okay. So, in this show, what I want to do is I want to go over why this theory had to come about. In the first episode, we covered the where and the who. We covered where it came from, when it came from, and who made it up. So we have a guy named Agassiz in the 1840s. He and a couple of friends, they go out, they decide eventually that huge world-spanning glaciers must have covered the planet 10 to 11,000 years ago. Now, why did these guys come to this conclusion? This is what I want to focus on today. Why does the Ice Age theory exist? What the hell caused it to even come up as a situation that should be imagined? I mean, what's going on? And the reason why the Ice Age had to be hypothesized was because as humans were developing in the past few hundred years, as sciences like geology, archaeology, real history, stuff like that started to get more and more resources poured into it, that meant that more and more discoveries were being made. And by discoveries, I mean, physical, actual discoveries. In this case, we are going to focus more on the geological aspect and probably the biological as well. But humans were running around and they were finding all of this weird stuff. Explorers were starting to find oddities, not only in the geological record, but they were starting to find oddities right on the surface of the planet that did not make any sense relative to the geography of the area that was being studied. Geologists were starting to notice that there were these formations called moraines all over the northern hemisphere. They were also starting to notice this in the southern hemisphere as well. And in fact, ultimately, moraines started showing up everywhere, and they started showing up in the middle of continents. In fact, they started showing up all over continents. Now, what a moraine is, here, let me give you the official definition of a moraine so that there's no ambiguity and so that nobody can talk crap about me later. A moraine is any accumulation of unconsolidated debris, regolith and rock, sometimes referred to as glacial till, that occurs in both currently and formerly glaciated regions, and that has been previously carried along by a glacier or ice sheet. It may consist of partly rounded particles ranging in size from boulders, in which case it is often referred to as boulder clay, down to gravel and sand, in a ground mass of finely divided clayey material, sometimes called glacial flour. Clayey. This is literally on Wikipedia, by the way, and they use the term clayey. That's not a real word. Oh my, okay. Lateral moraines are those formed at the side of the ice flow, and terminal moraines are those found at the foot. All right, here we go talking about one of the more important parts of what a moraine truly means for us. All right, a moraine marks the maximum advance of the glacier. Other types of moraines include ground moraines, till-covered areas forming sheets on a flat or irregular topography. Till, by the way, is another layer that we will discuss here in a second. And medial moraines, and those are moraines formed where two glaciers meet. All right, so the main takeaway here is that a moraine is a bunch of material essentially pushed forward as the glacier creeps forward. Essentially, it builds, it kind of digs up and bulldozes material in front of it. Then when the glacier, backs off or melts or whatever, what you are left with is a line of piled up rock and debris. So that's a moraine. Now, the moraines are important because geologists, the 1700s, 1800s, well, I'm sure everybody was finding these, obviously people were finding these things before that, but for our purposes, geologists in the 1800s started to really notice these things, and they started to notice moraines in areas that moraines made no sense in. So, by that I mean, they were starting to find moraines in large, flat areas. They were starting to find moraines in the mountains and hills. They were starting to find moraines all over the place. So what, right? I mean, who cares? You're finding moraines all over the place? Well, what the hell does that even matter? Who cares? Here's why it was a problem for geologists in the 1800s. Because geologists knew that moraines could be created by glaciers. The problem is that these moraines were showing up in latitudes that were nowhere near an Arctic or Antarctic circle area. Basically, what they were finding is they were discovering moraines in areas that by no means should have ever been glaciated. To make matters worse, these moraines were showing up at the equatorial areas of the planet. This was a problem because geologists back then had figured out that, yeah, glaciers could indeed create moraines, and they do. That's a scientific fact, not arguing that at all. We can go see that right now. But the problem is that they're finding moraines in equatorial regions, and they were finding them really all over the planet. Now, they did not find them necessarily everywhere. That's important as well, because some areas, for some weird reason, had no moraines. And these areas are the areas that really should have had moraines. Anyway, so in the 1800s, people were looking at this, and they were like, okay, what the hell is going on? So what happened is that a guy named Agassiz, he eventually came out with a theory that perhaps, I don't know, maybe 10,000 or 11,000 years ago, just pull a date out of the air. Who cares, right? Nobody can prove it anyway. He pulls a date out of his butt and then says, you know what I think happened 10 or 11,000 years ago? The Earth must have been magically covered in glaciers that spanned huge chunks of the globe. All right. Okay. Now at first, fine, maybe. Okay, it's not a bad logical jump. I get that. All right. And I'm not, you know what? I'm not even going to talk too much garbage about the 1800s people, right? They were working with what they had. They were. They were doing their best. And to their credit, they were actually making really good discoveries. The moraines and trying to figure out what they were is one of many of those discoveries. And we'll talk about some others here in a sec as well. But at the same time, they're human and they wanted an answer. They were not going to go to their grave wondering what the hell or how the hell these things were formed. They weren't doing that. They wanted an answer. Unfortunately, during this time as well, Lyell was creating his theory of uniformity. So what happened is that Lyell and Agassiz link up because they both need a lot of time to exist for this glaciation to exist, to create these moraines. And then, these two linked up, other people agreed with them, and these guys were at the higher levels of the academic spectrum, and then from there it exploded, right? That theory got pushed for no other reason than higher level people in academic authority were able to get a hold of it and push it. I mean, that's it. I mean, that is why it is embedded nowadays into mainstream academia. It's not embedded in mainstream academia because we have conclusive evidence of all of this. We don't, and we're going to go through all of that. But that's what happened. So if you believe the Ice Age is real, the reality is you're just believing a certain amount of psychological conditioning and you didn't question any of it. Now, I'm not putting you on the spot. I'm just saying people. I did the exact same thing. Never forget that. Anything I claim anybody else of being guilty of, I'm guilty of it as well. I mean, there's no question about that. In fact, I'm probably worse off than most of you guys. Right? It's crazy. All right, anyway, so geologists, they ran into a problem and they wanted an answer and they got their answer. All right, the Ice Age was created like that. So when the theory was proposed, it did a good job in their minds, because they believed it was real in their head. It did a good job explaining at least the moraine phenomena. Okay, so mainstream geologists, and I guess you could say historians as well, they were placated because they were like, yeah, that makes more sense. As a side note, really fast, I do want to mention this, and I probably should have mentioned it in the other show, but a lot of people don't know this. So during the 1800s, especially the earlier 1800s, we actually found an academic environment that was going down the catastrophic route. Believe it or not, people in the 1700s and 1800s were starting to honestly figure out that some horrific catastrophes must have befallen Earth, only a few thousand years ago. Maybe a little later, but not much. And people were starting to look at this because the evidence was right there. I mean, they were trying to do their best with the evidence they had and the technology they had to, to figure out, you know what I mean, quantify. Yeah, quantify. They were doing what they could to quantify the evidence that they had. They were doing their thing. Anyway, while they were doing that, the conclusions that they were coming to were catastrophic conclusions. They were looking around the world and saying, hey, this does not make sense in the context of kind of how we have been taught history of the planet. Now, it's also really important to remember that at this point in time, most people were still highly religious to one degree or another. The Bible was still the driving force in chronology, just like it is today. All of the scientists, geologists, etc., all of those people, they were still, they were psychologically conditioned into believing that kind of a timeline. So that was driving their thought pattern. And of course, they were operating under stuff like, the deluge, the great flood back in the day. And to make matters even more interesting with respect to the deluge, they were also discovering that more and more cultures out there also had the same stories. This was actually turning into a legitimate problem for scientists during this time period, because as people were connecting and meeting each other and sharing stories, everybody kept kind of looking around going, wait, you have the same story? Did we talk to you already? What is this, right? And everybody was doing this. Everybody was synchronizing in their stories, a lot of stories actually, but the flood was one of the main ones. Now, of course, at this point in time in history, in the 1800s-ish period, human chronology was not 100% locked in yet, but the Scaliger-Petavius situation was becoming more and more coded in stone. And of course, that chronology was employing the chronology of the Bible. So the biblical chronology was alive and well, just like it is today, in the sciences. So when people were looking around at this, what they were forced to do if they were going to be, semi-scientifically accurate, was they had to pay attention to all of these stories, because there must be something to these catastrophic stories if everyone has them. Now, back in the 1800s, this was not all that big of a deal, because back then, hey, if gods existed, a god can do whatever the hell it wants. If it wants to flip the earth around, it can do it. If it wants to, destroy it, it can do it. It doesn't matter, right? A flood is nothing to a god. So if the flood was true, which everybody believed with respect to their own religions and cultures, then there must be evidence for that flood. And that is what people were initially starting to look at, things like the moraines and a lot of other evidence on the planet. They were starting to find the geological evidence that began to point in the direction to corroborate everybody's culture's histories. Right? So people were starting, so it was kind of an eye-opener for everybody, because it was like, oh, the Bible, it's been taught to us as real, and hey, we're looking at evidence for a potential flood. And of course, other cultures, they weren't questioning it. Other cultures just knew it. They would look around and be like, yeah, obviously there were floods and destructions. We know that. This is why we're in the situation that we are in right now. Right? It wasn't weird to them. You know, it was only weird, sort of, to Europeans. Anyway, isn't it fascinating that catastrophism was already starting to be believed in by the sciences even in the 1800s? Another reason why catastrophism suddenly started to get more important was that people were starting to, pay attention to cosmology. Halley was down there discovering Halley's Comet. People were starting to look at the cosmological events going on in the sky, and they were starting to do their calculations, and they were starting to figure out more and more stuff. And one of the things that came out of all of this, out of this really real science, I mean, it was real science. It wasn't the greatest accurate science, but they were doing the best with what they had, and they were moving in the right direction. So when they were making discoveries with respect to comets, suddenly comets started to become a possibility of causing the destructions that were described in cultures all over the planet. And of course, this was a nice thing to grab a hold of because it's based on science. Like I said, yeah, they're still learning stuff, but the reality is humans were now realizing that cosmological events could possibly affect the planet. So catastrophism started taking off in the early 1800s. The problem with this, though, that happened, unfortunately, is that the catastrophists let their imaginations go too crazy. Apparently what started happening is that everybody started blaming all kinds of weird things on imaginary possibilities. There was no real evidence to back up a lot of their claims, to explain certain observations on Earth, and it started to become a problem because people were looking at catastrophists just going, I mean, at this point, those guys can imagine whatever they want, and it works, right? They don't have any proof for it, and it's not that it might not work, it's just there's no evidence. And so, like good scientists who had no evidence, they started getting sick of a theory. And that's exactly what should have happened. Now, that does not mean catastrophism is wrong, far from it. But, at least, hey, you know what? Let's give credit to the scientists back in the day. They started moving away from it because it was using way too many hypothetical possibilities to explain things on the planet and even in the cosmos. And that was, that's not, you can't really do that. I mean, you can have fun with it, but you can't sit there and base your entire theory off of hypotheticals. Like cosmologists do nowadays with black holes, dark matter, dark energy, etc. Yeah, it's just like those crazy people. Like they're just absolutely schizoid. Okay, anyway. So that was the problem that they were running into. So when Agassiz and his buddies came forward with the concept of the Ice Age, people were actually drawn to that for two main reasons. One, Lyell's theory of uniformity had taken more of a hold in the institutions of academia. So it was that had already been seeded in there, and you could look around observationally and give credit to Lyell and say, yeah, that might actually be the case. And that's what people started to do. Unfortunately, this paired with the Ice Age, really started to slow history down, and it also demanded that not only thousands upon thousands of years would have to be added to chronology, but literally millions and billions. So instead of people going on one extreme side with the catastrophism stuff, people swung to the exact opposite side hardcore. And this is probably the biggest mistake that was ever made. So we find ourselves watching humans play out human psychology, right? We see people swinging to one side and then getting sick of it, and then they swing to the other side. And right now we are on the other side. The ironic part about this is that both sides appear to be technically correct. Now, this problem is funny and also unfortunate because both sides were really onto something. It's just unfortunate that everybody had to pick one extreme or the other. And of course, over the decades, what happened is basically all of academia moved over towards the extreme uniformitarianism side. Once we started losing scientists to that side, we lost an extremely important perspective. And that perspective is catastrophism. Yeah, let's talk about this really quick. Why not? Who cares? So, what happened was is that you had those two sides. And nowadays, right, we're on that side of everybody gravitating towards uniformitarianism. You could make the argument now, actually, that the pendulum is slowly starting to swing back towards the center. If we can get that pendulum back towards the center, then we are looking good. Why do I say that? Well, here's the deal. The reason why people in the 1800s, in the early 1800s, were latching on to catastrophism was simply because that's what the evidence was actually showing. And I don't mean the religious or mythological or whatever evidence. Those are just nice bonuses. I'm talking about the physical, scientific evidence really was supporting the fact that Earth had gone through some sort of a tremendous cataclysm, not just once, but multiple times, and that these cataclysms could not have happened any later than, a few thousand years ago. And that's what they were finding. To make it even more interesting, of course, you could use the religious texts like the Bible to corroborate those facts. Because remember, at this point in time, that 6,000-year-old, Earth thing was starting to be more and more in vogue. So people were attributing that, maybe the flood of Noah happened in, 3,000 whatever BC or 4,000 whatever BC. There's various calculations, but that rough area is what had permeated society. So all of the scientists were latched onto that kind of a chronology. So when they were finding catastrophic evidence, it linked up perfectly, not only with the Bible, but with other cultures' descriptions as well. So this was all good. But like I said, they lost scope because they had to keep making up theoretical garbage because they did not have enough scientific evidence to really start to put them on the right track. They were not understanding planets like we do today. They did not understand comets. And they had no understanding, well, maybe a little bit of an understanding about plasma physics and the effects of electricity with respect to the Earth and cosmology and the interactions of everything within that. Obviously, electrical science at that point was progressing, and this is why people were starting to get a hint of it, but they did not know everything. They had none of the evidence that we have nowadays, so they had to keep making stuff up. It's funny, if you go and you look at some of those catastrophists' predictions, or the stuff that they quote-unquote made up, a lot of that actually tends to have some scientific backing nowadays. So good on them. Okay, anyway, so we have that dichotomy. If we can get back to the center, we're looking good. Why? Because both the theory of uniformitarianism and catastrophism are simultaneously correct. And this is, for some weird reason, something a lot of scientists don't want to believe. And it's the weirdest damn thing because we know for a fact that catastrophic events happen in the universe. Like, there's no arguing it. Right, we have cosmologists have no problem saying that, oh yeah, black hole exists. Yeah, black hole would cause a catastrophe, right? They have no problem saying that, but not on Earth. Nothing could possibly happen on Earth, right? Okay. Or they'll say other stuff about stars and planets revolving around stars and how it rains diamonds, or one side of the planet is constantly liquid molten lava and the other side is ice. And that's all crazy catastrophic stuff. That's insane. But, of course, our solar system is completely immune to the universe in all of the ways it can kill us. And that's what mainstream believes. They don't want to look at catastrophes. The problem is that we do indeed have evidence for catastrophes. So it's there, it cannot be ignored. Right? So, but the uniformitarianists aren't wrong either in the sense that, yes, over millions and billions of years, stuff happens, right? Stuff slowly happens. You can go witness this outside right now. You can literally watch a stream slowly move around, maybe carve a touch deeper. You can watch as things change, generally speaking. So, at the end of the day, we can really come to the conclusion that both are true. We are going to have insane catastrophic events that create a tremendous amount of damage in the blink of an eye. That's entirely possible and has happened. We know this for a fact. We can observe it in other parts of the galaxy and the universe, whatever, hell, even here on Earth. But we also know that things happen slowly regardless. Stuff keeps moving. We don't, the universe, for whatever reason, doesn't stop. It just keeps going, right? You may not be able to see it all the time, but everything is doing something. right? There's always heat being generated. And okay, anyway, I'm not going to get into all that. So anyway, so they're both true. I know I talk a lot of crap about uniformitarianism, but I guess I should set some of the record straight here. There's truth to that as well. So just remember that there's no reason to pick a side. I guess for 20 hours, that's what I'm trying to tell you. Don't pick a side. Fall in the middle, and suddenly everything will open up. Now, back to the 1800s, people were starting to find evidence of all of this stuff. The Ice Age theory is proposed, and due to the popularity growing for uniformitarianism, it was adopted. However, I would like to give credit where credit is due. The guys who started to build upon the Ice Age theory, they had not completely relinquished catastrophism. So this was good. And the reason why they had not completely let go of catastrophism was because the evidence would not allow it. Now, modern geologists, they still kind of look into catastrophism relative to the Ice Age, but we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so anyway, the reason why they could not let go of the catastrophist side is because the evidence was not going to let them do that. So aside from moraines showing potential ice sheet or glacial movement, they were also finding a layer on the surface and below the surface, not too far below the surface of the Earth, by the way. They were finding a layer called drift. Now, I'm going to give you guys the Wikipedia definition of drift, just so we can start on, even ground here before we start to tear this apart. I mean, it's a real layer. I'm not going to disprove the layer. It's a real geological layer. Okay, anyway. All right, here's the definition from that horrible place. You know what it is. Okay. In geology, drift is a name for all sediment, clay, silt, sand, gravel, boulders, transported by a glacier and deposited directly by or from the ice, or by glacial meltwater. The glacial meltwater is going to be a very important point for our discussion, so keep that in mind. Drift is often subdivided into unsorted and unstratified drift, glacial till, which we'll talk about in a second as well, that forms moraines, and stratified drift that accumulates as stratified and sorted sediments in the form of outwash plains, eskers, calms, varves, and so forth. The term drift clay is a synonym for boulder clay. Boulder clay will also be important in the future. All of this will be. Both are archaic terms for glacial tills with a fine-grained matrix. Basically, the drift layer may also be referred to as till. It's possible, and some people will separate them, and we'll talk about that a little later. Anyway, the fact that they were finding this drift layer was another problem, because the drift layer makes very little sense in the form of uniformitarianism, because one of the main things that creates this kind of a deposit is water flow. So in the early 1800s, when the drift was being looked at and studied geologically, it made more sense to people in the early 1800s because the earlier 1800s people were just agreeing with the concept of the deluge. So you would expect to find something like drift and till on the surface of the Earth because, just a few thousand years ago, the deluge had happened. So as far as a lot of those scientists were concerned, they had their explanation for this layer. They were like, yeah, obviously, Noah's flood happened, so we had a lot of water. All that water would have created this particular layer, and we're done. I mean, it makes sense, right? And it did. And there's some truth to that if the deluge is real. So anyway, so that was enough for them. Of course, what happened, though, was that as the studies continued and as people started to learn more about cosmology and science in general, that explanation kind of had to get thrown out the window because other better explanations were coming around, or at least they seemed to be better. And not only that, by the way, the till drift layer, it doesn't cover the entire planet, which is a problem because you would think that if there was a huge global flood, you would probably find more till and drift all over the place, but we don't find it everywhere. But we do find it in a lot of places. Like, it is there. So, okay. Anyway, so that's the situation that, they saw was going on, so they couldn't just ignore it. And then, of course, once the uniformitarianism theory and then, of course, the Ice Age theory popped up, suddenly there was another way to potentially explain this layer. And that potential explanation was ice sheets, because they could go to an ice or to a glacier and they could see some of this going on, right? You could go to an active glacier and you could see the same kinds of geological processes, sort of, happening at the foot of a glacier. And so people saw that, and it's not bad science. They saw it and they were like, okay, maybe this is true, but they took it too far, and that's when it became bad science, when they didn't do their full diligence and look at everything before they came to a conclusion. Okay, anyway. So this layer is found all over the place, and it needed an explanation. And so the Ice Age filled that particular gap. What's funny about this particular situation is that the Ice Age fills the gap not even from a real good scientific perspective, but it really just alleviated some of the stress that the scientists were feeling back in the day, because they were not finding real answers to their questions. Right? There was a lot of problems going on when trying to fit stuff in with the Bible, trying to corroborate other cultures, and then looking at the actual geological evidence. There was a little bit of a crisis. So the Ice Age came just in the nick of time. All right, anyway, but the till, from their perspective, while it was being blamed on glaciation, one of the things that these guys maintained, which was smart, was that still the action of large flows of water could also, and would have also, deposited this kind of a layer. So what they eventually ended up postulating, and it still exists to this day, like, I'm going to start choking Missoula flood people, but what happened is that they decided that, yes, at some point in time, the glaciers melted really fast, or like an ice dam broke, and basically a glacial lake poured out, huge amounts of water rushed out, and that would have been what would have caused a lot of the till areas or the drift areas that we see nowadays. It would have been from these mega floods. And then these mega floods, they reasoned, would have maybe been the explanation for Noah's flood. And that, unfortunately, is still kind of being looked at today. Well, not kind of. I mean, if you look at Christian geologists nowadays, I mean, these guys are obsessed with this magical ice dam over there trying to explain the Missoula floods in northwestern United States. It's hilarious to watch these guys cope trying to figure this stuff out, and they'll never figure it out because they don't. Anyway, we'll get to all that. Anyway, it just angers me, man. That's how you create a geologist serial killer. You just keep talking about ice dams. You keep talking about ice dams. I swear to God, I'm gonna go to the barn and I'm gonna get my sickle. I'm gonna dull it. I'm gonna dull the sickle on a rock, and then I'm gonna come over to your house and we'll find you let the hunt begin like Predator, and then we'll get. Essentially, the Ice Age helped explain the drift layer that was being found all over the planet. Now, there's a problem with the drift layer, and actually looking at the time, I'm not going to get into the details of every layer. So this is going to take forever, so that'll be another show. Like I said, this is going to take like 20, 30, a million episodes to truly lay out all of the science and all of the reasoning to show you guys that you don't need the Ice Age. Like, I'm not just asking you to believe this. This is a legitimate thing that we have to get rid of with respect to human history. I can't stress that enough. Okay. Anyway, so the Ice Age explained the drift. All right, fantastic. But you'll notice they still had catastrophism there. Now, that started to wane over the decades because, a giant ice dam, we don't really have proof of that. But, the ice melted, so yeah, maybe there was some water action. So, people started sort of meeting in the middle. The problem with that is that there's no real proof of how any of that went down. We have no proof that there was an ice dam. There's no proof of how fast the water melted, for example, from the ice sheets. We don't know any of that, right? Because it's all gone. And that's one of the things that geologists get to hide behind, is they can say, well, I mean, bro, all the ice melted. I can't prove anything to you. You just have to listen to me because I have this degree from Portland, Oregon garbage. Oh, you just shut up, okay? You just, okay. I promised I wouldn't get pissed. I've already okay. Anyway, so that's the drift layer. That is another reason why the Ice Age gained momentum. All right, let's keep going. The next thing that we run into, or the next problem that geologists were trying to solve, was the problem of erratic boulders. Once again, I will read the definition from Wikipedia so that we are all on the same boat, and so that you know I am not just making up my own definitions. We will go by the definitions that mainstream geologists use, and that's fine. It's not like these are wrong or anything. This is fine. Okay, anyway. A glacial erratic is a glacially deposited rock differing from the type of rock native to the area in which it rests. Erratics, which take their name from the Latin word errare, are carried by glacial ice, often over distances of hundreds of kilometers or miles. Erratics can range in size from pebbles to large boulders such as Big Rock, who is 16,000 tons in Alberta. That's the definition of erratics. Basically, what we find is we find huge boulders laying out in the middle of nowhere on like a flat plain or something where they really don't belong. If there's no, how the hell did those boulders get there? This was a question geologists had, right? They started seeing these things, they were finding them in very particular areas, and they were finding them all over the world. Once again, this is a global phenomena, but don't forget, it's not everywhere. One of the things that you have to remember, and I know we're not going to talk about it in this episode, but just keep in mind that the mainstream's version of the Ice Age, it only covers certain areas, and other areas are never touched. Or some areas are touched multiple times. And the patterns of the way things are affected kind of don't make a whole lot of sense. And we'll start to see that. And one of the reasons why some of these supposed glacial patterns don't make sense is because they will find erratic boulders in areas that really should have never seen any kind of glaciation. All right, anyway. Now, the geologists in the 1800s, they saw this problem as well. And of course, this problem kept growing because more and more people were bringing back information about erratic boulders all over the place, including areas that were around the equatorial parts of the planet. These discoveries started to become a problem for Ice Age people. So initially, when they were looking at the erratic situation, they were looking up in, say, the northern hemisphere, because that's where obviously all these guys were living. And they were looking more upwards towards the Arctic Circle area, and a little south of it as well. And they were finding erratic boulders. So with respect to the Ice Age, what they said is hey, look, the Ice Age explains erratics. Basically, what should happen is that the ice, or the glacial ice, will eventually just pick up these boulders and over time, very slowly roll them down south until eventually the ice melts and leaves the giant boulder in the middle of a plain. And that sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Right? Especially for the people in the 1800s, because erratics were a problem, but there actually was an answer for them. The problem is that the answer for the erratics kind of fell into the hypothetical catastrophism side of things. And of course, remember, at this point in time, people were getting sick of catastrophism because catastrophists were relying on too many hypothetical situations to explain things like the erratic boulders. But the explanation from the catastrophists was that, hey, these boulders were drugged down to wherever they ended up because of huge water flows. And the geologists did not necessarily disagree with that. And for example, even in the Wikipedia definition of this thing, they talk about fluvial deposits. Fluvial deposits means, rushing water, essentially. So even in today's day and age, thankfully, geologists are not completely clueless to the possibility of huge amounts of rushing water rolling over the planet, but they don't blame all the erratics on rushing water. They blame the vast majority of erratic boulders and material in general on the action of slow-moving glaciers. So this kind of causes a problem. Because if we're going to blame glaciers on all of these erratics, because that's what mainstream was doing, they might give in to a little bit of the flood hypothesis. Like I said, the Missoula floods. There's a whole school of thought over there in the mainstream that there was some magical ice dam that broke and created all of the geography that we now see over in northwestern America. And you know, they've got simulations and they make it sound all real smart, you know, but the reality is at the end of the day, you know, prove there was an ice dam, and they have nothing. Like, they literally have nothing. They might as well just say God did it. I don't know why they don't. I'd have more respect for them if they at least had some principles. Like, they just make stuff. Okay, anyway. All right, so, but if erratic boulders were going to be blamed on the slow action of ice, how the hell do you explain the erratic boulders in the equatorial areas? Like, what do you do with that? And how do you also explain the fact that erratic boulders are only found in certain parts of the planet, not everywhere? And of course, if you add to that the fact that boulders are found in areas that really should never have been glaciated ever, there were problems for Ice Age theorists. Now, a lot of this, of course, was initially ignored because there was no explanation for it until a little later. What happened a little later on, as more and more evidence mounted that if the Ice Age was true, that multiple huge chunks of the planet must have been covered in glaciers, not just once, but multiple times, and there had to have been glaciers in areas that would never technically support a glacier. This is what the science was starting to bring forward with respect to evidence. So this was a problem. So what did Ice Age people do to combat this? Well, Ice Age people then instead decided to say, well, fine, we find this stuff everywhere. There must have been multiple Ice Ages to explain this. And that's what they went off with, right? They say, oh, there's the Wisconsin glacial age, and then there's the banana boat glacial age, and then there's the jumping Jim jungle monkey glacial age. You know, they just started making up stuff to explain all of that evidence, okay? That's not how we do science, but that's what they did, and unfortunately, that has carried on to today. People honestly believe there were multiple ice ages that afflicted this planet, and that some of these ice ages grew out of the equatorial areas of the planet. All right, crazy. But this leads us to the other large, major piece of evidence that was used to support glaciation, but which also disproves it, ironically, as well. There is one other layer that was found on the surface and under the surface of the planet as well, that pointed to something horrific happening very, very recently. And when people were finding this horrific evidence, they needed a way to explain it, and the Ice Age was their way out of it. The layer that I am talking about, or the subject that I am talking about, that threw everything out the window, is a layer called the muck. Now, the muck deposit that we find on this planet, not only in the northern hemisphere, but on the southern hemisphere as well, caused a serious problem for geologists. Let me lay down what the muck is. I'm just reading from a general geological paper describing the muck. It's very kind of bland, but it gets to the point. It's not crazy. We're not over-embellishing anything, and then we'll go from there, right? So you can listen to a real academician talk about what it is, and then we'll take it further. Okay. The typical Alaska muck is described as a dark gray to black silt, principally derived from the underlying schist bedrock, containing a considerable quantity of vegetable material, lenses of ice, and strata of peat and volcanic ash. These silt or muck deposits are eternally frozen 3 feet below the surface. So it's like right there. This is not millions of years old. You know, this is not a bajillion years old. This would be a relatively recent deposit. So remember that. All right. Many of the local miners refer to these side valley deposits as dry muck. The muck blankets considerable portions of the interior of Alaska in thicknesses varying from 4 or 5 feet to over 100 feet in the vicinity of Fairbanks. Isn't that insane? 100-foot deposit, 100-foot thick deposit of peat, destroyed and shredded timber, destroyed and shredded animal life, and general deposits of volcanic ash. And this ash layers, I should say, that they find in the muck, they are not these perfectly little even layers that separate everything. No. What they found is, in this muck, they found all kinds of twisted layers of volcanic ash. Here, before we go crazy with this, let me just finish reading this and then we'll get into it. Because this layer is insane. And it shocks the hell out of me that this is not talked about way more in geology. Because the amount of... alright, anyway. These muck deposits and accompanying sedimentary deposits are regarded as late Pleistocene or early recent in date and overlie older quaternary gravels. The main point to take away from here is that this layer is not old. Like I said, this layer is not 10 million years old. It's probably not even 10,000 years old. The reality is well, anyway, it's a very young layer, and mainstream geology acknowledged this. This was one of the problems that geologists were running into in the 1800s because they had this insane muck layer that had no explanation. It was just like there, and it was huge, and it's all over the place. Okay, let's keep going. In the streams and valleys of the Yukon and its tributaries, most of the placer gold mining operations are carried on in these older gravels, the gravels that are underneath the muck. The superimposed muck, with its frozen bulk, must first be removed, consequently to expose the auriferous gravels beneath. Auriferous just means there's gold down there. It is in these placer operations, for the most part of a hydraulic nature, that most of the information of the muck deposits is to be gleaned. Basically, miners are going down there and just ripping this stuff up, and so geologists can then go and see what they're ripping up. Otherwise, nobody would be over there doing anything. Okay. Hydraulic giants of immense power are used to cut away the faces of the muck so that the summer sun may thaw the surface and the resultant... Sorry, it's like blurred there. And the resultant sludge be sluiced away. Basically, what he's saying is that there is this huge, thick layer in the Alaskan territories and in the northern, or in the Canadian territories as well. Basically, North America, we find a layer of up to 100 feet thick, containing huge trees that are all shattered and mushed up, literally torn apart animals and other kinds of vegetation and life. And it's a compressed thick layer of biological stuff mixed in with other little bits of rock debris and other silt and stuff like that. How the hell do you get a layer like this? To really think about this. I mean, it's like taking an entire forest, compressing it. I mean all the animals, all the everything, taking all that stuff, compressing it, smashing it up, and then just laying it flat over a huge tract of land. And then make that 100 feet thick. That's insane. There is a 100-foot thick layer under your feet up there in Canada and Alaska of nothing but dead and destroyed and decaying life. Actually, I say decaying, it's not decaying because it's frozen. And this is where things get crazy. So when the miners started going in here and trying to get to the gold, they have to drill through this muck deposit. As they were doing this, what they were discovering is just all kinds of trees. Like I know I've repeated it like twice, but anyway, they started finding all kinds of essentially shredded up forests smashed into this deposit. Now that's weird in and of itself already. Like, it's already crazy. The second part is these are not fossilized trees. These trees are still fresh. Their leaves literally still have chlorophyll in them. This is how fresh this deposit is. This is not a 10,000-year-old deposit. This is a very recent deposit of a unfathomable amount of destroyed life spread all over North America. That's insane. I mean, that is absolutely insane. What happened is that the Ice Age was then used to explain this layer. Somehow, magically, the glacial ice, the ice that moves like 1 foot a day, maybe, like if you're, I get, there's different variables, but anyway, the animals wouldn't be able to get out of the way of the glacial ice. Let's put it like that. No animal is worried about outrunning the glacial wall because it's just right there. I mean, it's not doing anything. You can step away from it at your leisure and not be buried in snow. But what Ice Age theorists say is that magically all of this life, trees, plant life, animal life, everything, nothing was apparently able to escape the glaciers, and it just smashed everything together magically, rolled over it, and then pushed it into the ground and created a layer. That's what they believe, that somehow a slow-moving glacier did this. Now, of course, we have no precedence for this today. If we go look at glaciers now, glaciers are not smashing masses of life in their path, right? We are not finding tons of deer or bears or anything like that embedded in glaciers, because why would you, right? A deer and a bear are going to walk away from a glacier. Nobody cares about the speed of a glacier. However, apparently, animals were stupid back in the day. And remember, the animals that exist in this so-called Ice Age period, these are animals like the mastodon, the mammoth, the woolly everything. You've got all kinds of crazy horses, beavers, lions, tigers. I mean, it's insane, right? There's all kinds of those megafauna that existed back in the day. And those are the kinds of fauna that we find embedded into this layer. This is basically where we can probably literally say that this is how these animals went extinct. They did not go extinct by some weird, magical, global, I don't know, whatever they blame stuff on nowadays. It wasn't humans overhunting them. Something happened that grabbed all animal and plant life on huge parts of this planet, smashed it together, and then spread it thin in the northern hemisphere. This also happened in the southern hemisphere. Things get even crazier with the muck deposit. So we find that up in the northern hemisphere, and we also find this up in the Siberia area as well. I guess I could, here, let me read this little section as well to kind of set the stage, and then we'll move on, and then we'll shut this down because I'm tired of talking. Okay, so let me read this small section. No discussion of the Alaska muck is complete without some reference to similar deposits in Siberia. Although these have not been completely worked, it was in these deposits that the first evidences of large extinct mammals were found. Beginning with the discovery of the first complete frozen mammoth, known as the Adams mammoth near the mouth of the Lena River in 1799, many such finds have been made. An idea of the immensity and the richness of these deposits may be gathered from the fact that trade in mammoth ivory dug from these mucks began in China as early as 500 BC. Now, 500 BC, God knows what the real date is with that, but it's true. The mammoth tusk is what essentially fueled the ivory trade. Most people don't know that. Most people think that, everybody's out there hunting elephants. No, everybody just goes up to Siberia because there are literally millions of frozen mammoths up there that you can just jack these tusks from. They're just sitting there, and they're free. You don't have to hunt at all. Just dig them out. That's all you have to do. All right, anyway. And has been estimated as high as 62,500 pairs of tusks for the last 2 centuries and a half. That's just the last 2 centuries. Do you know how much ivory has been mined out of the muck deposits in Siberia? Yeah, it gets crazy. This astounding number, even allowing for exaggerations in estimates, forms a very adequate background for human occupation of these seemingly inhospitable areas. This stuff is crazy. So basically, Siberia is amazing because it also has this muck deposit. Everything is still frozen over there. Hell, not only do they have the muck deposits, there are literally islands up there in the Arctic Circle that explorers and geologists literally say are essentially made out of broken mammoths, broken life, broken trees, and muck and mud. There's entire structures made out of this muck deposit. That's how much life was destroyed and flash frozen only a few thousand years ago. This is insane. The fact that this is not like right in the front of all geological studies is baffling to me. We literally have layers 100 feet thick of frozen, destroyed plant and animal life, and we don't care. Nobody cares. It's even funnier because not only are they mining these areas for like the tusks, but they actually mine them for energy. They burn that muck for energy. And this has been going on for a while, right? Anyway, so that's the northern hemisphere. All right, fine. So they were going to try to use the Ice Age, or they do use the Ice Age, to try and explain that muck deposit. There's about 1 million problems with that, and we'll go over that later. But that's another one of the reasons why the Ice Age was postulated, was because of these muck deposits. Now, one more thing really fast with respect to the muck deposits. Not only do we find them in the northern hemisphere, up in the Arctic Circle area in south, we also find them in the southern hemisphere, and we find them at the equatorial areas of Earth. It gets even crazier when you start to look at those equatorial deposits and you see them up high, like 10,000 plus feet in mountain ranges. They have literally discovered all kinds of megafauna and megaflora smashed together in the cracks and crevices high up in the Andes. And by high up, I literally mean 10,000 feet plus. People were discovering all kinds of mammoth bones, mammoth tiger type of things. You know, basically any kind of that megafauna. They were finding huge, smashed together deposits in these crevices. This was such a problem that when Darwin ended up down there, when he was doing his little trip around the world, he was like, oh crap, like I have no explanation for this. In fact, this is actually one of the discoveries that almost caused Darwin to revoke his original theory, because it makes no sense. It literally makes no sense. The evidence that they were finding does not jive with anything that takes millions and billions of years. How do you get a mammoth carcass 10 plus thousand feet into the air in a mountain range in the equatorial regions of Earth? This is a problem. Of course, the Ice Age was proposed to explain these kinds of deposits. However, how do you get a glacier 10,000 plus feet in the air, somehow covering mammoths and other, megafauna and flora? How do you do that? How the hell does that work? And you have to do it at the equator too. It doesn't make sense. Scientifically, it's ridiculous. Right? This is probably why you have never heard of these discoveries, because it causes a lot of problems for geologists, because they do not have a real explanation for it. It gets even funnier. Okay, well here, that's the muck deposit. All right, so I just wanted to go over the basics of why geologists had to create the Ice Age theory to explain the observations that we see around the planet. So if you've never questioned the Ice Age, ask the question, why does the theory exist at all? Some of the stuff that I've talked about in this show is the reason why the theory was proposed at all, and then of course, perpetuated on down the last couple of centuries, because it attempts to explain evidence that otherwise has no real good explanations, at least when it comes to utilizing mainstream science. It's not there. Now, it gets funnier. Like I said before I got off track. It gets funnier. So, for example, those muck deposits that we find in South America, those are in the Andes, 10,000 plus feet up in the air. That's a serious issue. Glaciers do not explain that at all. Right? Anybody with an IQ above 5 can point that out. There's no glaciers. It gets funnier because the Andes, and this is what mainstream geologists are willing to admit to, by the way, the Andes and all other mountain ranges, potentially all other mountain ranges, have been proved to have risen to their present height only in the last 10,000 years. What does that mean? What that means is, potentially, that the muck deposits that you see there in the Andes, for example, they were not created at 10,000 feet. They were more than likely created at a few hundred feet above sea level, and then something happened 10,000 years ago that made the mountain ranges rise up overnight. This is what the evidence shows. That is the real science. There's nothing to argue about, by the way, because like I said, this is even a mainstream perspective. This is not some schizo thing that I just came up with. Geologists admit this. If you've never heard of it, I'm not surprised, because of course it changes everything you thought you knew. So, in this show, all right, we're done. I gotta move on. I got stuff to do. So, you see what I'm saying? All of the reasons why you believe in the Ice Age, question them all. And I'm going to continue to try and destroy, your perception of the Ice Age so we can get you out of it so that you can start doing real history and real science so that we can actually figure out what the hell happened on this planet a little while ago. So that maybe we can get some sort of semblance of cohesion and start working together. All right. The Ice Age was created because geologists needed to explain all of the insane geological evidence that has been discovered over the past few hundred years. And there was no good explanation for the evidence back in the day when this was proposed. Remember that. Remember why this theory was created. It was not created because science demanded it. It was created because human society needed an answer, and they were not going to wait. So now we find ourselves in a position to where we are essentially behind where we really should be with respect to our knowledge of geological events in the recent past. So we have to start getting rid of the Ice Age so that we can look at the evidence that we have in a new light and potentially discover the truth.